Good afternoon, everybody. We'll just kick off the webinar now. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we sort of get into the detail. There's a couple of key buttons for those of you who are running Link via the web browser here. So if you want to ask a question, bottom left-hand corner, just pop your questions in there. We'll collate those and address those at the end of the session. Alternatively, if you want to look full screen or choose the presentation view, bottom right corner will help you do that as well. Right, so a bit of an agenda just to sort of kick things off here. So we're going to start with introductions for myself. There's only one of us, so that makes things nice and quick on that front. Setting the scene, so ultimately what are we hoping to achieve and hopefully ratifying with why we're all here really. I'll also cover a few real world scenarios, some examples of what we're talking about, how it can apply to different people, and then follow through with a live example. I'll try and keep that a bit of a balance between technical and sort of high level as well. The business relevance aspect is going to just extrapolate that example in more detail and try and sort of align that to what might work for yourselves internally, followed by some next steps and some investment information as well. So who am I? I'm a SharePoint architect and also the SharePoint practice lead here at BlueSource. I've been here for a number of years, and one of my strengths, if you like, is around business process optimization. So hopefully that sort of comes through in the next 45 or so minutes. Okay, so to kick things off, let's set the scene and let's sort of run through a few examples and some facts and figures. So in terms of why we're here, we've got some stats here, both from our own surveys that BlueSource has run and also the IDC, in terms of essentially what people are finding with business processes. So just to pick on a couple of these, so 1 in 3 processes are still dependent on manual activity and paperwork. And if you also look at the one at the bottom left, 4 out of 10 people claim that paper processes are a significant barrier to efficiency within their organization. So this is something we're hoping to try and answer and extrapolate for you today. In terms of, there is a better way, and what we're going to focus on here is electronic forms and also workflow processes, and I'll cover those in a lot more detail what they are. It's also worth starting off actually just understanding what is a paper process. It can mean different things to different people. From our perspective, this is really anything that you need to fill in to get something done. So examples of that is leave requests, expenses, employee onboarding, starters and leavers, that sort of thing. The other key thing of why there's a better way is paper processes are prone to errors. So if you think about, these processes typically involve printing off a document, filling in some blanks by hand. Sometimes it's difficult to read writing. Sometimes in larger organizations, there's multiple offices. So this piece of paper has to be sent to somebody, mailed, posted, etc. And also, what if information's missing? Does the process have to start again? Does somebody have to come back and talk to the initiator and so on? Now, one scenario that I'm going to flesh out in a bit more detail later on, but just to give you an early sort of snippet of facts and figures, is think about holiday requests. So there's a little bit of artistic license in terms of the stats, but hopefully this resonates with most people as well. The reason we've picked on holidays here is it's one process that almost everybody as an employee with an organization has to participate in. Some of the examples that we cover later on will be a little bit more niche to different groups. So within the UK, of course, each average full-time employee is entitled to 20 days or more of annual leave per year. And this is where it sort of starts to get interesting, because if you start to think about these blocks of holidays are typically 5 or more, sometimes it's less, sometimes it's 1 or 2 sort of key blocks. And also, it depends on the number of staff as well. So if we had 200 staff, you've hopefully sort of read ahead and can see, well, actually, 5 requests per employee, I'll extrapolate this 30 minutes later on, times 200 employees. Actually, we're talking up to about 12 weeks per annum of somebody's full-time effort combined with an organization just to manage this particular manual process. So what we're really sort of focusing on here is an electronic solution could save in the order of magnitude of around 2/3 of that time. And again, what sort of value does that have to your particular business? And this kind of shoehorns into some of these examples of actually the return on investment can be a little bit of a no-brainer for that one. Okay, so SharePoint. This is essentially the underpinning platform of what we're talking about. The reason we tend to sort of recommend and use SharePoint is in itself, it's a good base platform, and hopefully Most people here already have SharePoint or know what it is. If you don't already have it, don't worry. This is all still relevant. It's just a separate conversation to worry about the SharePoint platform piece. I mean, at its heart, SharePoint fundamentally stores everything in documents and lists. Electronic forms come into play because they can ultimately store their information into lists for easy consumption. So we're really just talking about a layer of exposure on top of SharePoint. One of the key weaknesses of SharePoint is its workflow design interface. Fundamentally, it's got a workflow engine, which is great, but in terms of end users and business power users being able to manipulate business processes, both creating and maintaining those, that can be a little bit difficult. The other sort of key thing about SharePoint is most organizations, as I touched on before, tend to already have this, and those that don't often do as a result of licensing rights and so on through Microsoft as well. The other sort of key point here is it's not always obvious how to extend SharePoint. We work with a lot of clients who actually have SharePoint already available to the organization. This might be used for a basic intranet solution, document management, and these sorts of things. But actually, you can push that investment a little bit further. So, if we're looking at electronic forms and workflows, it's a good chance to rejuvenate a platform that you may already have in place. The next sort of key topic to really cover is Nintex. Now, Nintex is a partner of ours, and they're a third-party product that adds on top of SharePoint. The main sort of coinage here is it's workflow for everybody, and hopefully that becomes quite apparent when we start to look at this in a bit more detail. In terms of how it fits, technically, it's a simple installation on top of SharePoint. All workflow configuration and design is done in the browser, so you don't need to install any additional software. In terms of rapid development, this is something that's going to come up hopefully a lot more in the next few slides, where very complex business processes can be done in a matter of minutes or hours as opposed to days or weeks. And that's what the key value of this toolkit is. The other important one down in the bottom left corner is progress monitoring. When you think about a business process that involves numerous people or numerous stages, it's often very difficult to understand where things are at. Who do I need to go and chase? Please give me a report on everything that's waiting on HR to action. It's these sorts of questions. And the toolkit has options available to actually deep dive and see where processes are at as well. This may seem semi-trivial for very basic examples, but if we were to have a compliance-based workflow which is running for 7 years or 8 years from a retention perspective, this becomes very relevant in terms of long-term view of progress against things. Final point I wanted to touch on there is mobility. This is a sibling product, if you like, of Nintex Workflow, which is the main focus for today. But I just wanted to bring it up because there's a couple of screenshots that you'll see which show, I suppose, the next level of where things can go to help users on their own devices to actually participate securely in business processes as well. Okay, so how does this look today? So if we sort of think about a new starter process, it's quite common for a manager to email HR. I want to, have a new person join my team. Manager sends it to HR. Oh, actually, that now goes to different departments. Maybe there's some information missing. You kind of get the idea. Obviously, a little bit of over-embellishment, but this is not too far from the truth for most business processes. What we end up with is a paper trail. We end up with a lot of information that actually, if we dedupe this, if we actually think about the core information that's required to get a message across or get a process through, there's probably a much simpler way. So this is an early sort of screenshot, if you like, of what a workflow looks like implemented within Nintex within SharePoint. It's a high-level view, and we are going to deep dive into this a little bit more. But ultimately, it's all about having a much more controlled and simple view of designing a business process. One of the other examples here, and I mentioned it in a few slides before, is the visibility. So what we're seeing is a very small cross-section, obviously, but within an HR stage, actually, we want some details from HR. So actually, what's the pay of this particular new person who might be coming on board? Green here is good. Actually, we've completed this particular task. Yellow is who we're waiting for. So we actually want to obtain some details from HR. This is something that the end user is not going to see by default, but you can click through and start to audit processes as well. So it's not creating noise, but it's a powerful tool to help you to drive things forwards. So if we try and run with analogies here, essentially what's the before. It's a little bit of a spaghetti junction, if you like, in terms of many processes. Again, I'm making very sort of sweeping statements, but hopefully everybody can resonate in their own level of saying, actually, there are some things that do seem to be a lot more cumbersome than they ought to be. And ultimately, the main aim of this particular session today is, to give you the road to freedom, to show you that there's better ways to do these things. So current barriers. This depends on each organization, of course. Ultimately, it's a case of looking at forms that need to be filled in by employees. So far-reaching examples which affect everybody. We've already touched on that with leave requests. Or it can be more niche. So if we look at starters and leavers, it's very complex traditionally, but it only tends to involve a very small group of people. So be it IT, be it HR or line management, average sort of end user employees don't really need to be involved with that. The other sort of key point there is responsibility for a particular process. So this can be difficult for something that's been running for, a large number of years. And in itself, this is almost something that's worth looking at. We've worked with many clients who have actually come across processes and they say, well, we always do this because it's the way we've always done it. There's no owner anymore. That's a red flag in its own right. Well, actually, what's the end game from this? And another key point on top of that is, for a particular process, what is the output and what is done with it? If it's not stored anywhere, or if it's not reported against, why is it being done? So it's these sorts of questions. So that sort of, at a high level enables you to identify things that might not need to exist anymore, but perhaps more importantly for this session, what's something that involves a lot of time, a lot of steps, or a lot of people, and can we make that a more optimal experience for those involved? In terms of the involvement, there's really sort of three key groups of people. It's those who submit information, it's those who maintain that information, decide what needs to happen as a result of that. So those are the business process or the workflow designers. And it's those who need to action that information once it's been captured. And from a user adoption perspective, we find that this is almost non-existent in terms of issues, because since what we're talking about is based on a familiar platform to most people, i.e. SharePoint, it's seamless behind the scenes. Actually, people react very positively because their life has been made easier. So again, just back to the definitions, and the reason I keep doing this is, as you hopefully appreciate, in IT there's many different views for different things. So just to put a bit of a wrap around this session, so what is an electronic form from the perspective of what we're trying to cover today? So it's ultimately a form that we can complete within the web browser, or in this example within SharePoint. More importantly, it includes validation to ensure clean information is captured. And this is a common issue with paper-based processes as well. So do you want to select a client? Do you want, somebody's going to spell something slightly differently? Is that different? Is it the same? So it's these sorts of things that come into play. Equally, if you're doing expense information, we want to make sure it's valid, numeric information in there as well. And more importantly, an electronic form saves information into a repository for action and further processing. That's the key thing here, because once we look past that, we come into what's a workflow. And a workflow really picks up from where the electronic form finished. So we've captured some information. Now what do we do? There's a business process that we need to assign to this, and what happens next. So workflow really, by definition, is an asynchronous process which follows business rules. What that really translates to is we map and define a business process. For example, once I've filled out this form, department or person X then has to complete something. Once I've done this, A and B have to complete something. So it's as complex or it's as simple as you need it to be. But the key thing is that the workflow will wait for you. It will push out tasks, it will push out information. It's something that can run for many, many years depending on how that process needs to operate. One example that we're going to see in a little bit more detail is when we want to obtain information. So back to our starters and leavers example, somebody from HR might automatically say, well, actually, what are you going to pay this person? What have you agreed? It's that sort of interaction that the workflow can be responsible for. And the bottom point is very, very relevant. So it's all about driving the process. One difficult thing when people, think back to when you join your current organizations, it's all well and good knowing that something needs to be done, but what happens next? Sometimes it's well documented, sometimes it's not. So the idea of a well-designed and thought-out workflow or business process is that you shouldn't have to think about it. And monitoring governance is also key, particularly for long-running workflows or when you've got compliance considerations. So what we're going through now is a few real-world scenarios just to try and resonate a little bit. So the first one is just building on starters and levers, which is what we've been talking about for the last few minutes. So from a line manager's perspective in HR, this tends to be quite a heavy burden. And some of our feedback from clients has been actually this is one of the big hitters because it's something that's often overlooked. It's traditionally very, very manual, and almost everybody in some form, even if it's simple, has this requirement within an organization. In terms of who's involved, typically, and I'm just making some broad assumptions here, HR, so actually we need to set people up in payroll, that may well be a separate process. IT, we need to create them an account, somebody might need to order them a machine, or facilities, where are they going to sit, which office? It's these sorts of questions that are typically involved when somebody comes on board within an organization. The other sort of final point there, if you think about, from a compliance perspective, offboarding is also very, very important. So, when somebody leaves an organization, what needs to happen? Maybe there's another workflow process that's important for that as well. Disable the AD account, notify some key stakeholders via email, and so on. So we're not at the live example yet, but just to sort of flesh out the stars and levers examples, this is one of these infamous here's one I prepared earlier. So bear with me with a few screenshots. Now, this is showing an electronic form, which I've created in SharePoint. And on the right-hand side, just as a little bit of a teaser, I touched on it earlier, this is Nintex Mobile. So this is a sibling separate product to their workflow that just goes to show, well, actually, in the world of gathering information, it's all about giving people different avenues into that. So many, many people will probably opt for just saying, actually, I'll just log into this from my intranet, I'll fill out the form, and I can kick off a process. Alternatively, and starters and levers in its own right probably isn't the most relevant for mobile, but if you have a leave request, you could initiate that on your phone. If you have expenses, and we'll touch on that in more detail, you could do that on your mobile, take a picture of your receipt, and it can start to send things off. This is kind of where things can start to head. So in this example, I've captured a new starter request for Ross. So to start things off with, this example workflow, and this is fairly representative of how most people choose to implement it. I've kept things simple. So what we're seeing here is an email that's been sent to the HR contact. To keep things simple, it's all coming through to me. So I'm wearing all sorts of different hats today, saying actually a new task has been assigned to you. There's a new starter request for Ross. Kept it simple, but equally, I could put information in the subject line, I could put information in the body, and I'll show you how to do that just to give you a bit of an experience of how powerful and how easy it is to ultimately implement a business process and how you can customize it. So HR can click to respond to the task, and I've decided that actually here's the key points that we need to know for starters and levers. Have you checked their employee references? Now, I mentioned earlier that workflow processes are about driving what needs to happen. It doesn't always have to do it. So there's nothing here that's actually going and checking the references, although there could, and that's a wider conversation. But it's more a case of there's a checklist. Have you gone and done that? Yes, I have. Were they satisfactory? Yes, they were fine. Comments, hey, we're good. And in this case, you want to produce business cards? Yes, no, or do I want to defer that until after the probation period? These are just some sample examples there. So after we've gone through HR, we've gone through the first hurdle, now comes down to IT. So the IT manager or key contact, as we sort of see fit, will receive an email task, such as what's on our screen now, saying, actually, there's a new starter request for Ross. I could put information in here. So I could say, well, actually, here's his address, or here's the desired email address that HR's filled in. By the way, the references were okay. It's all up to you, really. So if we click on this particular task, the options that we're presented in this particular case, and again, I've just decided to make up these three questions, so they're not sort of pre-canned, if you like. Do you want to create an Active Directory account for them? What's their email address? And what's their login? We could work this out from the name, but I just wanted to expose this just to show what the options are. Finally, once we've got past IT, in my sort of demo world here, we've got facilities. So same sort of scenario, an email will go through to the facilities contact. They can respond to the particular task. One tangent I want to sort of jump onto here is these tasks, since they're based on out-of-the-box standard SharePoint tasks, could also be synchronized depending on versions and so on with your Outlook tasks. So you can actually start to blur the worlds a little bit. So that's just something to bear in mind. So in this case, what desk has been allocated? F32, and yes, I've gone and done the security pass setup. So one thing that's always very nice is something like this final image on this example, really, where, by the way, here's an email that you might want to print off and give it to the new starter when they turn up on day one. There's their login, there's their email address, there's their password. This is automatically created. Now, note earlier with the IT task that we said, can we go and create the Active Directory account? Behind the scenes, I've actually gone and created an Active Directory account in this workflow. So before I took the screenshots, that's the sort of thing that you can start to do on the fulfillment layer as well. So hooking with Active Directory, I could create their Exchange email box as well. So particularly for those IT individuals who are here, these sorts of things can be quite powerful in terms of automating this process for you. And we can have separate conversations about the technical details and how simple that can be. And we can see finally it's been processed and job done. We've now got a list where we can start to manage individuals. Importantly, since everything's sitting in a list, we can expose that as we see fit. So we could actually put this into a spreadsheet. We could do some reporting against it. You know, it might feed into some attrition plans. It all really depends on what works for your organization based on their size. This next example, I'm not going to go into all the screenshots. I'm going to keep these next few sort of high level, and then we're actually going to roll our sleeves up a little bit and go into a real workflow. Just to try and sort of resonate. So sickness and return to work can be quite sort of cumbersome in terms of process, because ultimately, as somebody's off work, most organizations require some level of self-certification. What was the reason? I was ill, looking after my family members, etc., etc. One reason this is quite good also, as an example, is it's something that involves all employees within an organization. It's not just something like the starters and leavers where, although it's complex and it's very sort of value add, it only touches a small percentage, relatively speaking. The other sort of key problem with, I suppose, sickness and return to work certification is the manual process can be a little bit difficult because it's easily missed. Somebody has to remember to fill it in and these sorts of things. So there's many ways to make this better, but again, this is just a real-world example where, hey, perhaps we make a very simple electronic form. A line manager has access to just open up this little pop-up box. Maybe there's a link from the homepage. They can just type in somebody's name. They weren't here today. That's all they have to do. The workflow will then kick off the following day and say, oh, look, Ross hasn't turned up to work today. I'll send him an email with a link saying, please come in and fill in your information of, you know, trying to not justify, but give me a bit more background. So you can actually have workflow processes sleep and wake up and do all sorts of things like that. The next example is travel costs and expenses. I lightly touched on this earlier, and this is something that I think I'm probably correct in making the statement of most people find this very, very painful. The reason for it is it's complex. And again, this depends on how your individual organization needs to work. But, you know, pre-approval is something that comes into play often. Is this verbal? How do we automate things? How do we tie this into things when we want things to be signed off? Receipts. Again, this depends on individual, but it's not uncommon for many people to have dozens of receipts to try and collate. You know, let's write out the details, who was involved, and all this information capture is a real burden at the end of each month. Whereas if you start to look at this electronically and how can we make this better, why can't we have an electronic form or expose that onto the mobile to say, look, I've just taken a train journey today, that's who it was for, take a quick picture with my phone, push submit, and that's now gone in behind the scenes into a process, and that's just going to sleep there. And I can just keep doing that every day, multiple times. And then at the end of the month, the workflow says, actually, Tim, here's all of your expenses for the month. They're all grouped together. There's the total. Anything else to add? Or if you're okay, just hit reply to this email and say, submit, job done. That will then work out who your line manager is, send it off for approval. It's easy. You can pick away at it. And again, this really depends on what works for yourselves. Some organizations are all over the fact that you can have electronic receipts for compliance reasons, or maybe it depends on the amount of spend. There could be some restrictions around that, but it all depends. One thing to point out is whenever we're talking about electronic forms here, we're doing it from within SharePoint, so it already knows who an individual is. So you don't really need to worry about signatures. It's already authenticated you as a user, so that's kind of a given if that wasn't already clear. Okay, so the final example, don't worry, it's not going to be too much more death by PowerPoint, although there will be a little bit more, is holiday requests. And this is one that we touched on a couple of slides in with some facts and figures. So actually, what is the real burden of this? So multiple submissions are very, very common. I think it's very much an outlier if somebody says, you know what, I'm taking 20 days in one block, if they're even allowed to do that. Another problem that employees have is it can be very hard to find out what your remaining leave balance is. Again, this is one of these interesting ones because many people may have a bespoke system or an external solution which takes care of holiday requests, but where implementing this with Nintex and SharePoint works really, really well is if you've already got SharePoint, it's a bit of a no-brainer, if you like, in terms of people coming to one place. They don't have to sign into other systems. So you can build these things up very, very easily with the investment that you've already got. The other key challenge with holiday requests is the scheduling. So actually, once it's been approved, how is this visible to the rest of the business? Does this automatically put something in my calendar? Does this put something in a team calendar or within a SharePoint calendar? All these things, the answer is yes, it can. And again, it just depends on trying to align what you need to achieve. The default position, and this sounds very salesy, is technically, yes, we can do what you need to do with this. The other sort of key thing is if you think about multiple approvals, and this is where paper-based processes get really confusing. So what happens if we need to get this approved by project manager first? Once there's no project impediments, then I can go to my manager, then it goes to HR. But actually, what if the individual's a manager already? Do they really need approval, or does it just need to go through to somebody? This is where things can get a little bit messy with paper-based processes. And electronically, we can allow for all this. So if we speed this up a little bit in terms of jumping into the detail. So I mentioned earlier, I've made this bold assumption that's half an hour overhead to do every leave request. And from the perspective of feedback from clients, this has been very true for many. So if we run through this, 10 minutes for the employee is probably feasible. If you think about, I'm working on something, I've got to stop doing that, I've got productivity loss, I've got to find the form, maybe it's in my inbox, maybe it's on the network drive, print it off, complete, sign, deliver to manager. Do I have to walk over to their desk? Do I have to find an in tray? These sorts of aspects. For the line manager, review that. It's all about trying to find the information and what do I do with it now. And if we finish off on the HR side of things, again, if it's not electronic at the moment, what happens? Does that need to be scanned? Does it need to be retyped? Does a leave balance database have to be updated separately? It's these sorts of challenges. And just to remind you, so even if we take this 200 employees over half an hour, 5 requests, and again, this could be a lot more or a lot less, it's this sort of figure that we're looking at of actually what's the return on investment from trying to do this in a more efficient manner. So the scenario that I'm going to run through, and this is where we're actually going to go into SharePoint and have a look at the workflow, is intentionally dumbed down just so we can get through it in the time that we've got. So the user can click on a shortcut on the intranet homepage, complete a simple electronic form. Those details are then sent through to the manager for approval. Keyword there being their manager. It can auto detect that from Active Directory depending on how that's up to date. It's a simple yes or no, and if it's a yes, we're going to update a calendar and update the leave balance as appropriate. So let's just jump into a live example. Okay, so what we've got here is a relatively straightforward SharePoint site. So what I've actually made behind the scenes is a simple list that's going to capture some information. So on the bottom left, we're seeing a form. Here's my basic leave details, and on the right, there's a leave calendar that's going to be up to date. Underpinning this is a workflow which we're going to pop the hood on shortly. So if I just go ahead and put something in here, we'll say for Monday the 17th, and this is where I probably should have done things slightly different. Hopefully some of you are looking at this saying, well, actually, if I've got a from date and a to date, why do I need to put the number of days? This is a good example where if you map an existing process as it is, you need a little bit of intelligence in there to say, well, I don't need to capture that anymore because I already know it. Equally, do I need a field on this saying who I am? Don't need it because it already knows who I am. I'm logged onto the system. Day returning to work, so if I save this, okay, so our request is in progress. And we'll just give that a minute to kick off. Right, so what we've got here is we've got one submitted item, and what that's doing behind the scenes is that's going to send an email through to myself saying, by the way, there's been a new leave request, we've acknowledged that, and there's also an email that's going to go through to my manager saying, actually, are you okay with this? Do you want to go ahead and approve it? So just to sort of stitch things together a little bit, basically jumping to here is pretending I've just got an email just because I'm trying to do this in real time. So as a manager, I would have received an email similar to what we had for the starters and leavers when it said, click here, there's a leave request for Tim. Do we want to approve it or do we not? And that would take to the form that we're seeing right now. So if I say that's approved, let's just pretend I'm going somewhere nice. Had I rejected that, of course, that would have jumped back and said, well, hey, I'm sorry, but this hasn't been approved. So keeping things a little bit simple without jumping between the emails, what we can instantly see here is an entry has been added. So that's one of the tasks that we wanted to do. An email behind the scenes has gone back to the initiator, which is myself, saying, by the way, this has now been approved and your latest holiday balance is now X number of days. From a security perspective, if somebody else was to log into this, they'll only see their own leave requests. So that's something quite important to note as well. Obviously, if I'm HR, if I've got the appropriate rights, I can search and I can see everybody's details. So all I'm showing you here is nothing special to Nintex. It's just a way that I've configured SharePoint. So what I want to do now is just jump into the workflow very, very briefly. So if we say, well, actually, this is the list where my items are being saved. So if we look down before, here's where things are coming through 4 days from now. Here's some examples. Now I mentioned that Nintex literally sits on top of SharePoint. This is how seamless it is. So we've got an option here. We've got the normal SharePoint workflows, or we could manage workflows with Nintex Workflow. So I'm just going to load up this editor. First thing you might catch me doing is just minimizing a whole bunch of little controls. Think of these as a folder. As part of any workflow, there's all sorts of sort of setup things you might want to do. So do I want to connect to Active Directory? Do I want to look up various things? But the general concept, and hopefully you're not getting too sort of intimidated by this, is it's really a what you see is what you get editor. So at the simplest level, if I want to do something, I can just drag a task on. I can double click on that particular task. So at this stage in the workflow, I might want to send an email notification. I could put in someone's name. I could also look this up and say, well, okay, I want to know the initiator. So this is the person who submitted the form. What's the subject? I'll make that leave request for. Maybe we should put their name in there. That's probably something quite useful as well. Now, one thing that's very integrated is the ability of a workflow with Nintex to actually jump in and have a look at fields. So if I've captured the fact of what's the holiday year, or who's the person who submitted this, e.g. created by, I can get at that list of information and it will evaluate that when the workflows run. So it's something very powerful. Maybe there's some other properties I want to expose, etc., etc. Who's the manager? What's the title of this leave request? So you can start to be very dynamic with how you interact. One other example is you'll sort of note the statuses here. So this is what's known as a state machine. I won't go into detail on that, but it's just a nice way of grouping things. So we submit something, it's either approved, or it's rejected, or it's cancelled, or there's a little bit of basic error handling. Now what we might say is once something's been approved, maybe I want to change the value of something. So as simple as this, I might want to set the title to be approved now. I might not, doesn't make a lot of sense in this particular example, but just to try and sort of articulate how actually it's very, very simple to get information. Or actually, I want the title to look up another list where the ID equals the same one and get more information. You can really build up quite complex things or keep things very, very simple as well. It's up to you, really. What we're talking about on the left-hand side, and I'm not going to do a deep dive, is these are called actions. So there's integration points. I can interact with SQL if I want to expose information. So perhaps I've already got an HR database. Perhaps there's information there about individuals' leave balances. The workflow can be smart enough to go and have a look at that. Again, the sky's the limit within reason. So let me just jump out of here. So in terms of the business relevance, and I appreciate that this is literally a whirlwind sort of tour of what the actual technical details of the product are. But you know, what are we looking at here? So take the leave request example. We're seeing a simple and visible process, so based in SharePoint, which most users are familiar with. And of course, I had that leave calendar. There's nothing stopping me connecting that through to Outlook. And again, people can interact with this information as they need to, really. From the intuition perspective, the process drives itself. So as a manager, I didn't need to chase anything. I didn't need to go and look at my in-tray for forms. Something would just come through to me as an email notification saying, by the way, Tim's looking for some leave. There's the details. We can embed that in the email. They can click a button, complete the task. Actually, it's off their back. And it's about making those stakeholders more efficient as well. And since everything from an electronic form is ultimately stored within, in this example, a SharePoint list, hey, there's reporting potential there. We can open that up in Excel. We can draw some graphs. We've got options around that. In terms of what we can do next, one thing that was hopefully apparent in the starters and leavers process was where we had the Active Directory account creation. So workflows are a little bit of a combination of, well, we need to guide you what to do, but also we can help you to do that as well. So in terms of how far we can go, you can create very complex line of business workflows. So, these can be workflows calling other workflows. We've got some customers who literally run their entire order management system via these workflows. So again, we're only focusing on simple examples, but it's just a case of scaling these things up. Workflows can also be bound to SharePoint content. So if we think about a proposal document, maybe we've got an automatic retention policy, maybe we want a workflow to start behind the scenes to kick off some approval. That's all possible as well. So in terms of practical next steps, the first few slides said, well, actually, what are the impediments towards moving forwards here? It's really a case of identifying, I think, the top 3 business processes. So what are those processes that are time-consuming? How many people are involved or affected or participate in each of those processes, and really start to map this out. So do it yourself, work with partners like ourselves to actually say, okay, we can do this in Visio, we can just sketch it on a piece of paper. That's really the starting point of where you then look for those common points and say, well, okay, do we need to do that? Or is there a more efficient way? Or actually, let's just do a like-for-like mapping. Business sponsorship is hopefully a bit of a no-brainer. I mean, we've got facts and figures. It's about understanding what your process does in terms of effort at the moment and mapping that through to how we can move forward and say, look, leave requests, I think we can save a lot of time across the business by implementing this, for example. And from our perspective, we always recommend implementing a bit of a proof of concept first. So actually, let's just get in there and make something relevant. There's some low-hanging fruit. What's a particular pain point for the business? So just some technical points in terms of what's required there. So SharePoint is a prerequisite of Nintex. Nintex works on SharePoint from 2007 onwards, and also SharePoint Foundation, which is the free version, upwards. So there's not a lot of constraints there. It can be implemented with SharePoint Online, which is part of Office 365. Installation and configuration, you saw how easily it integrated with SharePoint. The installation is very similar. It's just a solution which gets installed as part of SharePoint. And in terms of process creation, it's really a case of implementing a selected business process just to really sort of kick things off. So on the investment section, I just wanted to be fairly transparent about what's the rough order of magnitude of this. So in the next couple of slides, if we sort of just jump down, so we've got 2 main editions we've been talking about. So the standard and there's also enterprise. And this is at the Nintex aspect, so assuming that SharePoint is already in place. The standard license really gives you most of the things you want. And to be honest, 90% of people can get away with standard. The main difference between that and enterprise is some of the fulfillment options. And I've used this example a couple of times, creating those AD accounts or creating those Exchange email boxes. That's where you start to tip over into the enterprise side of things. I'm just seeing if we've got any questions here. Okay, so one question is, what happens if there are other systems to communicate with outside of SharePoint? Ultimately, it's all about web services. So if there's an API, if there's any sort of web services, the path of least resistance, Nintex will natively communicate with that and parse information, and we can use that within workflows. And if there's not an interface available, that's where there's a bit of custom development to actually ultimately build a web service that Nintex can consume, but also other business processes as well. Okay, so that's the key question that I've got. So from my perspective, it's time to wrap things up. I just wanted to say thanks for everybody for taking the time to join. And if there's any sort of questions after the fact, my contact details are on there. And yeah, thanks again for your time.